A very good evening to all of you, and I welcome everyone who has joined today to the ICFAI's Wise Views Interactive Webinar Series, the 14th in this series today. And today we have an extremely distinguished leader with us, Miss Vinita Bali, who is going to speak about the responsibility of leadership. Ma'am, we are very delighted to have you here. And I would like to also mention that our chairperson, Mrs. Shobharani SSP, is also present here. I welcome Shobharani Garu also to this webinar session. She has joined to listen to you, ma'am. So it's my pleasure to introduce our chairperson to you here on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rao, and many thanks to the chairperson for spending an evening, for this talk. It's a great honor to be invited and given this opportunity to speak with your students, and it's always a wonderful interaction. So what we'll do over the next hour or so is I will share some initial comments with all of you, and then we will make it interactive, because the way I see it is that this is a session that is for you, and you need to get the most out of this session rather than my just talking about things that I feel like talking about.
As you discussed, the first 30 minutes will be a talk delivered by yourself, ma'am, and then the next 30 minutes will be the question and answers moderated by senior colleague Professor R. Prasad and I. These questions were picked up at the time of registration, and also some of the questions will be picked up in the chat box during the conversation as well. Yes, ma'am, I take pleasure. It's an extreme honor and privilege to introduce Ms. Vinita Bali to the members who have joined today. Ms. Vinita has an undergraduate degree in economics from the University of Delhi and a master's in management from the University of Bombay. She also pursued postgraduate studies in international business from the prestigious Michigan State University. Ms. Vinita Bali is a business leader with extensive experience in large companies, both in India and overseas. She has worked with eminent multinationals like the Coca-Cola, Cadbury's, in a variety of roles like marketing, general management, and chief executive officer in UK, Nigeria, South Africa, Latin America, and the USA, in addition to Britannia Industries Limited in India. She brings a global and pragmatic perspective to strategy, marketing, innovation, and operations, having worked across countries and continents with responsibility for global and regional roles. Effective April 2014, Ms. Vinita moved from a full-time role as MD and CEO of Britannia to pursue her wide-ranging interests in the corporate and development sectors. She is a non-executive director on the global boards of Cognizant Technologies and SATS Limited. She also served on the global boards of Syngenta International, Smith & Nephew, Bunge Limited, and GAIN. In India, Ms. Vinita serves as a non-executive director on the boards of CRISIL and Syngene International Limited. She is a member of the board of the governors of IIM Bangalore, and she chairs the CII National Committee on Nutrition. She was also on the board of Titan Company till March 2018, which started from 2006. Ms. Vinita was among 27 global leaders appointed by the UN in 2012 to help improve maternal and child health as part of its Scaling Up Nutrition initiative, and completed her term in 2016. She has been recognized in forums nationally and internationally and won several awards for her various contributions to business and society. This is an amazing profile, and we couldn't have got a better speaker than you, ma'am. As I said, it's our extreme honor and privilege to have you with us today to speak on the responsibility of leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, we give you Ms. Vinita Bali. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Rao. As I, started off by saying that, we'd like to keep this interactive, and I thank you and the chairperson and everybody else who's on this call for sparing your time today to do this. What I'm going to share with you is what I have distilled from my experiences. It's unlikely you will find any or all of this in a book, because my assumption is that if something is in a book, anybody can go ahead and read it. But this is lived experience, This is something that I have thought about, reflected on, and would like to share the insights from a journey which has actually been, even from my point of view, quite fascinating, much beyond my own expectation and my own dreams. If somebody had asked me when I started life as a management trainee in Voltas that would you see yourself living and working in 6 countries on 5 continents, being given the opportunity to travel to 70 or 75 other countries, I would have said that's a bit of a joke. But it all happened. And it all happened not because I planned it, I could not have planned it, but it happened because opportunities came my way and I tried to make the most of those opportunities to the best of my ability. And in the process, I learned that, leadership is about taking responsibility more than anything else. It's about taking responsibility for yourself as an individual, and it extends to the responsibility we undertake in the roles that we perform. And therefore, I would like, as my first thought for all of you, is really to say that let's not use the word leader and leadership interchangeably, because very often we tend to say that just because my designation happens to be a CEO or a president or a vice president or a prime minister, that we are leaders. Frankly, confusing a position and a designation with being a leader is one of the things that I want to talk about not doing. And the reason I say this is that I have learned that leadership is about behavior. Leadership is about what we do, not what we say. As a wise person said once, that your actions speak so loudly, I cannot hear your words. And I think that's, for me, the first tenet of leadership. And that is, what is my behavior? Because that behavior is then open for everybody to see. People can determine, is this someone whose leadership style is credible and reliable, or is this someone who says a lot but then doesn't do very much or does exactly the opposite of what he or she is saying? So let's start off with the premise that leadership is about what we do. It is therefore a verb, not to be confused with a title or an entitlement or anything like that. Once you accept that premise of leadership, then it does not matter what your role in any organization is, whether it is a company, an academic institution, an NGO, the government, or anything else. What we are then saying is that at any level in the organization, starting from when we start life as management trainees or IT trainees or engineer trainees or whatever it is, we display qualities of leadership. And let us not forget that when we go through school and college or institutes of higher learning, we all assume roles of leadership. We are captains of a sports team, we lead the dramatic society, some people stand for elections in their college, and so on and so forth. Those are all leadership traits and characteristics. So we don't have to wait till we've got a fancy title of a vice president or a general manager or whatever, and then say, oh, by the way, now I am a leader. Leader and leadership is what you do every day of your life. It is what you do at your place of work. It is what you do with friends. It is what you do at home. There is no conflict. I cannot be one person in the office and somebody else at home, which takes me to a second quality of leadership, and that I have called authenticity. Authenticity is about not pretending to be who you are not or what you are not. because people are smart enough. People see through what you are saying. They may not say it to your face, but people see through individuals. And therefore, authenticity is another very important quality of leadership. And it simply means that, I will do what I say and I will say what I am going to do. There is no conflict from that point of view in leadership. Leadership is also about taking accountability for what happens, whether or not it is within your purview or control. So let me give you an example that made a very big impression on me when I was, a child. I was, in class 2 or 3 or something like that. And at that time, our Prime Minister was Jawaharlal Nehru, and I remember Lal Bahadur Shastri was our Minister for Railway. There was an accident that took place, and coach got derailed, and I don't now remember whether there were any casualties in terms of deaths, but certainly there were injuries. Before you knew it, the railway minister, Shastri ji, had tendered his resignation to the prime minister. Why did he do that? He was not driving the engine, he was not controlling the train, he was not, responsible for the signals. But that is where the sense of responsibility, authenticity, and ownership for results comes in. He took moral responsibility as someone who was in charge of the Indian railway system to say, this happened on my watch, and therefore I tender my resignation. There were no ifs and buts. There was no making excuses. There was not saying that this didn't happen or that didn't happen or somebody did this or somebody did not do this. Therefore, taking responsibility, holding yourself accountable before you hold anybody else accountable, and being authentic are very, very important qualities of leadership. I would even go to the extent of saying that none of us have any moral right to hold someone else accountable if we are not ready to hold ourselves accountable. This is not a lesson in moral science or morality or anything like that, but it certainly is about a work ethic. And what is a good work ethic? A good work ethic is about acting with responsibility and accountability. It is about taking ownership not for inputs but for outputs. It is about taking ownership not for effort but for result. Very often in an organizational sense, especially when it comes to the end of the year and we are talking about merit increases and performance bonus and so on, I've seen there are two kinds of discussions. One kind of discussion is that, we haven't achieved what we set out to do, our budget or whatever, and therefore our annual bonus has to be commensurate with that less than full achievement. There is another kind of conversation, which is we haven't achieved, but by the way, so many other things happened in the environment which came in the way of our accomplishment. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that as people who are responsible for what we do, our responsibility is not to make an excuse. Our responsibility is to find the best way possible and navigate the scenario. And right now, everybody is navigating a very challenging scenario, which is uncertain, it is ambiguous, it is complex, it is complicated. I'm talking about, how the world has become topsy-turvy as a result of COVID. But that does not mean that we externalize our performance. That does not mean that we use the environment as an excuse for non-performance. It does mean that we take responsibility and say, under the new set of circumstances, what is the best that my organization can do? If you are a commercial organization, then those are the metrics. If you are an NGO, the metrics are different. If you're an academic institution, the metrics are different. So the bigger point I'm trying to make is that leadership is about being accountable and taking ownership for results. I think there's another very important characteristic of leadership, and I would call something like that, I would put it under the umbrella of character. I've talked about work ethic. And what does a good work ethic really mean? A good work ethic is one where we say that there are certain rules that we play by. There are certain rules of good governance. There are rules which say that things are right or things are not right. But in reality, we are all dealing not just with black and white, we are dealing with shades of gray. And it is in those shades of gray that we need to use our best judgment. We need to use the best possible standards of governance, the best possible cadence of governance to come to decisions and conclusions that are going to be the right decisions and conclusions, not something which is expedient, not something which benefits a few, but not everybody. And it is in those circumstances where we have to make those calls, which are not necessarily black or white, that leadership is tested. I want to end this whole thing by, giving you a thought which really says that oftentimes when I think about leadership, I think about people who have stood the test of time, not because they were in a particular role or they had a title or they had been given big awards, but because of the consistency of their behavior, because of the credibility not just of their words but also their actions, because of their reliability, and because they inspired people to go beyond the ordinary. The one leader, the one person I would say who comes to mind is someone who is from India. It'll be easy to guess. It is someone who never had a formal title in his life. It is someone who never got an award from Economic Times or Business Standard or the Nobel Committee, either during his lifetime or posthumously. And yet, it is someone who around the world, even to this day, over 70 years after his death, and someone who has inspired other leaders like Mr. Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, etc., and that is Gandhi. If you think about it, he made himself extremely vulnerable. He talked about things that many other people would hesitate to talk about. And oftentimes, when we think about vulnerability, we say, it is the weak who are vulnerable. It's exactly the opposite, actually. You have to be very strong, you have to be very confident to make yourself vulnerable. I'm not saying, all of us go to the extent that he did in terms of talking about so many aspects of his life, including his personal life. But I think there are examples to be taken from there. And I was fortunate enough to live in two places where, as I mentioned, Mr. Mandela as well as Martin Luther King, lived and did most of their work. One is when I worked with Cadbury's in South Africa. And I also had the very, very good fortune of meeting Mr. Mandela. This is before he had become president. The election was in 1994. I went to Cadbury as a professional, one of the first professionals, not one of the first, actually the first professional from India in South Africa. There were people of Indian origin in South Africa, but they had gone there several years before that. And I remember at a function where Mr. Mandela was there. I was there. He was very intrigued that I was living on my own in Johannesburg and how I had traveled from India to come and work in South Africa. And, there were many people at this particular function. But there was a time when I found that he and I were alone because, people had drifted and we had to walk to where the formal function was to be. And it is one of those moments that, you think about in your dreams, but when it happens, you're completely tongue tied. And I'm saying, what is the one question I can ask, somebody like Mr. Mandela? So I asked him, I said, you were locked up in 27 years, of which many of those years were in Robben Island. And I actually traveled to Robben Island to see the cell that he was in, which had a window or a ventilator right on top. So you couldn't even, lift yourself up to actually see the beautiful view of the ocean, which is where Robben Island was. And I said, what was the most difficult thing for you? And his answer tells us something about the character of leadership. He said, uh, my biggest fear was that when the time came for me to take the responsibility to lead my country, I should not hold anything against the people who have put me in this cell. Now, it requires great fortitude, it requires great courage. It is a huge test of what we do when we are put in places like that. Fortunately for most of us, I don't think we are going to be put in a situation like that where for 27 years we're in solitary confinement. Those people were made of something else. Nothing came in the way of their determination, their commitment, their dedication, their passion to achieve the results they believed were the right results. So I want to end with saying that leadership is also about conviction. If you don't have conviction in what we are doing, then the chances are we will treat what we are doing as something that we have to do because it gets us money, which then makes us do all the other things that we want to do. But life would be so much more enjoyable if we really liked what we did. And again, I want to say something that somebody was asked, um, how do you how do you continue to work with energy and involvement and engagement? And this person said, well, do something that you like and you'll never have to work a single day in your life. Now, these are not just empty statements. I know that all of us, myself included, have to do things in our corporate responsibility or in our academic responsibility or in our whatever leadership responsibility that we don't really like to do. Lots of people say, lots of scientists say, give me the science. I don't want to be, lumbered with administrative things. Well, I have news for all of us. That is never going to be. Uh, but if we begin to take joy in what we do, if we begin to believe that our work has some meaning, or if we are able to find meaning in our work, then it makes work interesting, it makes work engaging, it makes work actually quite easy. And then, many people ask me this question about, how do you achieve a work life balance? And, my answer to that is that work is one of the things that we do in life. It's not the only thing we do in life. So my life is not, it's not about how my life fits into my work, but how my work fits into my life. And I think that's another thing that you will see in terms of leadership behaviors. These are people, if again I were to go back to the example of Gandhiji, I would say he had so many, he did so many things simultaneously. He wrote, he traveled, he gave, he talked to audiences, he led protest marches, he founded a newspaper, he was associated with the university, he wrote letters, he wrote, at that time, letters were handwritten, and he wrote from everybody from, Hitler to Rabindranath Tagore. He engaged with scholars. He found time to go and meet Charlie Chaplin. And, by the way, he also led India's freedom struggle. Now, when you think of it that way, one of the other essential qualities of leadership is high energy, actually, because you can't accomplish things with low energy. And that then takes you to, how do we look after ourselves, which is very, very important. And, again, this pandemic has put us in touch with so many realities. One of those realities being that, unless we keep good health and we look after ourselves, it is unlikely we will be able to do the many things that we want to do and contribute in the many ways that we want to contribute. So, with these remarks, I will end, my session and throw it open for any questions from the audience, either based on what I have said or anything else that anybody has in mind.
Thank you, ma'am. This is amazing. The way you have put it in such a simple language, and yet the takeaways are so profound for us. Leadership is all about action, authenticity, accountability, and display your character in terms of conviction and work ethic in so many ways that you have explained, with some real life examples that you yourself have gone through and probably gained from your interaction with the legend Nelson Mandela himself during your visit, during your stay in South Africa. These are amazing inputs and experiences that you have distilled for us. As I said, we couldn't have got a better guest than yourself today for this topic. It's amazing, ma'am. Thank you very much. And now, in the interest of time, I will invite my esteemed colleague, Professor R. Prasad. I will introduce him, and then we will start the Q&A session immediately after that. Professor R. Prasad is the Director of Academic Wing at ICFAI Group. He is the Professor and Course Mentor for the online MBA program, which he architected and launched very recently. He is an alumnus of IIT Bombay and IIM Kolkata, and has a rich experience of 3 decades, both in academics as well as industry. And he was an entrepreneur himself before joining at ICFAI. And now I invite him, Professor R. Prasad, to initiate the moderation of question and answers. Over to you, Professor Prasad.
Thank you, Professor Rao, and very good evening, ma'am. It is indeed an honor to be moderating a session like this. The focus that you have put on the qualities which you have seen has worked as responsible leadership gives a lot of insights to many of the questions that our audience has asked. We have close to about 320 people who have registered and some who have joined up, and there are more than 250 questions which have come up at the time of registration. So what we have tried to do is to cluster them and then put them into groups, which is where it is all integrated, and then put it into the right perspective for you to respond to. I also take this opportunity to welcome Madam Shobharani Yashasvi. It's indeed an honor that she's also joined in for this particular session. And now we move to the question set, ma'am. The first is basically about leadership, and it is about why is responsible leadership so important for organizations and society today, and what should be the first and foremost responsibility of a leader, and what should organizations do so that they create numerous such leaders?
So I think that's what I have talked about for the last few minutes. I don't mean to be facetious, but when we say, why do we need responsible leadership? I could turn around and say, because we don't want irresponsible leadership. That's primarily why we want responsible leadership. And, we keep thinking about the role that organizations have to play. And I do believe organizations have to play a critical role in defining the parameters of leadership, in rewarding the right kind of leadership behaviors, in penalizing the wrong kind of leadership behaviors. Because on the one hand, organizations keep talking about how engaged people are. Think about all the things that organizations do. We spend a lot of time doing surveys with Gallup to see engagement scores, great places to work, what is the NPS score, etc., etc. Whereas our own data should be telling us how engaged people are. Whether you look at how many people want to join the organization, attrition rates, etc., etc. So I think it is time for everybody to stop and say, if people is really the differentiating factor in the performance in any organization, and I do believe it is, because it is the people who determine the quality of thought. It is the people who determine the quality of action. Without people, there is no organization. So if we say that people are the key asset and everything actually begins and ends with people, not with capex, not with artificial intelligence, not with any of those things, then we have to say, who are the people who are spending time on fostering those kinds of leadership behaviors? I, in all my working life, have said HR is not responsible for people. People are responsible for people. HR is responsible for making sure that all the administrative processes, etc., are in place. But if I am leading a group of people, then I am responsible for those people. HR is not responsible for those people. So one of the other qualities of leadership is the quality to be a good listener. It is also the quality to be an empathetic listener, which is really to say that when people we are working with come to us with ideas, how do we react to those ideas? Do we shoot them down or do we encourage those people? How do we deal with diversity of views? How do I deal with you if you come and tell me something which is exactly the opposite of what I believe it should be, and I just happen to be your manager? Are we welcoming of dissent? Are we welcoming of diversity? And these are things that have to be reflected on. They have to then not be in the vision, mission, values statement of the company that goes on the website and then nobody talks about it. Unless we actually see values in action, very little is going to change. And that is the responsibility of leadership.
Thank you, ma'am. I think you have reinforced on what you have presented earlier, with specific context to that cluster of questions. Here's another question, ma'am. Again, you have indeed dwelled on it in the presentation, but I'll put the context and I'll also post the question. So many have come from that direction. Maybe some fresh perspectives also will come in. Every work has its own responsibility, and does leadership responsibility differ? Yes, you have
does leadership, sorry, I didn't get, does leadership responsibility
differ? The responsibility of leadership, does it differ from other work responsibility? People also want to know about attribute styles. Of course, you have presented that earlier in the new normal. And does this differ? All these things, do they differ based on whether it's an MNC or a startup or a social venture or a political venture, or based on people, whether it is Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z? This is the question.
I don't think the basic tenets differ, but I also think effective leadership is also about understanding context. If we don't understand context, and if we don't club that understanding of context with empathy, and understanding of context also comes from empathy. If we are not alive to what is the situation around us, if we are not alive to what is on people's minds, then it is unlikely that we will be able to connect with people. And if you don't connect with people, then the communication goes like that. There is no point of connection. So I think effective leadership is also about understanding not just the text, but the subtext as well as the context, and finding common ground, finding that common ground, finding that shared purpose, finding those issues is really the crux of leadership as well. So if I were to put it in a political context, when the G20 nations go and they talk about climate change and the Paris Accord and so on, everybody is coming from different perspectives. But if at the end of the day, they all come in with a commitment to find a common ground of action and then work with that common ground of action, none of those things will be effective. And I think the world has actually seen some of that. I mean, there are 200 countries that are signatories to the Sustainable Development Goals. There are another 200 countries that are signatories to climate change agenda, etc., etc. Now, I'm taking a very large political context, but I'm also saying that within an organization, we keep talking about diversity. Diversity is not just about hiring women and men and so on. Diversity is about diversity in thinking. What are the different perspectives I can bring to bear on a situation so that a solution to the problem that we believe we have is going to be a comprehensive and a well-rounded solution, and not looking at it with a blinkered vision or with a tunnel vision.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that is added value to what has been already been built up, and the text and context dimension is extremely useful. I think we keep talking about it even when we go to class and talk about management, because it's not theory, and you need to connect to what is there actually when you work. And I think this response has also answered a number of other questions which you were about to post, because the dimensions of leadership which are conventionally understood, like flexibility, governance aspect, authority, power feedback. I think you have brought the text and context as also built in that you need to look at it specifically, and that all of these are valid, but then they need to be connected. Thanks a lot, ma'am. So this is the first section that we have just concluded. I'll hand it over to Professor Sudhakar Rao for taking on the next section.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ram.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I think as the discussion is progressing, we are peeling off many, many layers, and we are trying to examine and understand and take away the important aspects in the whole concept of leadership and responsibility. Ma'am, here I'll be focusing one or two small questions on the how part of it. As you agree, the world needs to spread the leadership. It is a thing of the past that there used to be one leader and many followers. Today, we need to take everyone along with us, including those crushed souls. There's sometimes who can adapt to rapid change and who cannot. And there are people who have to be laid off, people, resistance, adversarial mindsets, crisis, pressure. Yet we need to retain focus and including the one on work-life balance. How do we build a responsible leadership, including so many things?
Well, there is no other option, because if we are dealing with a diversity, not just in our employees, but also in our customers, also in how things operate, then unless we have a comprehensive perspective, it is unlikely that we will be able to deliver against the demands of any organization. And I don't think leadership is about a how-to exercise. If it was that easy that you go in and you check some boxes and everything will fall in place, that's not it. Which is why I think leadership has to be harnessed from the time I join an organization as a management trainee. As a management trainee, my exposure may have to be different. When we come in as individual contributors, then we become responsible for a small group of people, then we become responsible for a team, then we become responsible for a geography, then we could become responsible for a business, then become responsible for an entire company, and so on and so forth. So each of these are experiences that should add to the dimensionality of leadership. And it is incumbent upon the organization to create those pathways for people who are willing to take that mantle of additional leadership responsibility. I think it is fine, let's say, if I were a chef, in a restaurant. I would come and tell you, don't make me the manager of a restaurant, even though it may be a more senior position. I love the work I do as a chef. And that is the reason why when you look at some of these, restaurants, etc., the chef gets paid a lot more money than the general manager, even though in the hierarchy, you might find that the general manager is more senior. And that is because these are individuals who are doing specialized roles and they don't want to do anything else. And I think that's another important factor that we must take into account. If you say, chef, you've done a great job as a chef, your next promotion is a general manager, the chances are that you will end up getting a mediocre general manager and you will end up losing a brilliant chef. So leadership is also about using your judgment.
Amazing, ma'am. Leadership is all about using your judgments against so many inputs that we come across day in and day out. The next question I would request you to answer is about, again, a simple looking question is that what is the one thing that a leader needs to practice day in and day out?
Authentic behavior.
Authentic behavior.
If I'm not authentic, nobody's going to believe me. I mean, people might follow you out of fear. People might follow you because you can intimidate them. But in my dictionary, that is not leadership. If people are fearful of you, leadership has to inspire. Leadership is not about creating fear or adverse consequences if you don't follow what I'm saying.
Amazing. Ma'am, this brings us to another interesting point is, and again, it is being very, very practical about, how do we control anger in leadership?
It's not about controlling anger in leadership. It's about controlling anger. Why do we feel that leaders need to control anger and others don't? But if you follow my definition of leadership, everybody is a leader. Therefore, everybody needs to control anger. So I'll tell you an essential quality of leadership. We were talking about, and we feel that we need to, look at large companies, large corporations, etc., for leadership. This is a story which is very much out in the public domain. I have personally written about it in a paper that I wrote, which was called Leadership Lessons from Everyday Life. And I'm saying leadership is not about, the title of a CEO or a CMO or, whatever. So this is the story of a woman who probably right now is about, I don't know, over 100 years old. She lives in a village in Karnataka. Her name is Timmaka. And Timmaka was married off, like most women in India are, very young. And she lived with her husband in this particular village. And, over a period of time, discovered that they could not have any children. And, there were people taunting her, etc., till she chanced upon this wonderful opportunity, and that is that the government used to give saplings to this particular village to plant banyan trees. And Timmaka started a movement in her village where they would take these banyan trees and plant them alongside the road. The entire village planted more than 600 or 700 banyan trees. And it just changed, the ecology and the environment of the village. Of course, some reporter from outside of India came to this village, looked at it, reported it, and then everybody became very interested in Timmaka. She got a Padma Shri. She was, recognized by, people around the world. Now, in today's language, if Timmaka was educated, we would say she's an environmentalist. Okay, but she is an environmentalist, whether she's educated or not educated. How many of us have gone and taken the responsibility without any resources, created a movement in the entire village where they would not let a sapling go waste, but every sapling in this village was planted, and it became a role model for everybody else. And she continues to live in the village. She continues to live in that hut. She has not, despite her Padma Shri and other awards and so on and so forth, she's also been flown for conferences, etc. Now, that is a story of someone who had nothing, but who created everything with whatever little she had. That to me is leadership.
This is an awesome story of Timaka, who created a lot out of thin resources that she had at her disposal.
You can all go on Mr. Google and put her name, and you'll see the wonderful work that she's done.
I will do that, ma'am. Definitely, we'll take that separately. So, but it is an awesome story in the sense that I'm sure there are many, many stories to come. But at this stage, ma'am, with your permission, I will call in Professor Prasad to start the next cluster of questions that is on education. Professor Prasad.
Thank you, Professor Rao. One of the questions we keep getting, from many of our those who register for the webinar, which is not only here but in the earlier webinars, is why do you conduct these webinars? So I think this is one of ICFAI's gestures that inspiration is something that is needed in daily life. In fact, one of the challenges in education is inspiration, and you want to learn. And you want to connect what is there in the concepts to what is getting applied. It is actually inspiration which helps. So this is one thing that we are trying to do. With that, ma'am, we also are looking for inputs from you that if you need to create leaders early in life, and that becomes something that is built across and then goes into organization building, people building, community building, nation building. Then what should higher education institutions do, institutions like us, and what can programs do which can include things which will help in this particular task?
So first of all, we should stop talking about how do we create leaders. I think if you substitute that question with how do we encourage leadership behavior, we might end up somewhere different. I don't know, you have to determine that. I think education is not about attending a seminar or reading a book or anything like that. And I believe forgetting whether it was Mark Twain or Oscar Wilde who said, "I've never let schooling interfere with my education," which tells us something. What it tells us is that, education, to my mind, I think comes from curiosity. If I'm curious about learning, if I'm curious about, geography, I would, look up things on a map. I actually had an uncle, who, these were days before the internet and everything. And every time he sat to read a book, beside him would be an atlas and a dictionary. And so we said, why do you have an atlas or a dictionary? He said, because if I hear of a country, I want to know where it is. And if I hear of a new word, I want to know what it means. Now, did anybody teach him that? The answer is no. But I do think we can't correct higher education. We have to start correcting education from the very beginning. To expect that, somebody has been through the system which rewards rote memory and all of those things, and then suddenly we come into higher education and we expect a metamorphosis to happen. Unfortunately, we are not caterpillars who will turn into butterflies. We will continue to be what we've been taught. So I think education has to be addressed at all levels. And I think education is not just about reading a book. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that today, trying to teach me something that I can very easily go online and find out is not really education. But if education is going to open my mind, if education is going to make me curious, if education is going to make me come alive with questions, if education helps me find connections, if education can help me understand context, if education can help me be more empathetic, more, what should I say, responsive to my environment, that is education. So let me give you a completely different example. We keep talking about climate change. I mean, just look at the recent spades of forest fires and floods, and who had heard of people dying in Canada because of a heat wave. We hear of people dying in Bihar because of a heat wave, not in Canada. Now, if this is not climate change, then what is? But if my education had taught me that, that tree outside my window is giving me oxygen, which is helping me breathe and making me healthy, then I would think not twice, but many times before cutting down that tree. Today, I have no relationship with that tree. We have huge relationship with our cell phones. We keep upgrading, we keep downloading, we keep doing all of those things. Now imagine if we had that kind of relationship with our environment. We would not cut trees, we would not waste water, we would not pollute our rivers. That is education. I mean, if I have to go and learn about Indian history and, which Mughal king came before which other Mughal king, I can go and look it up very easily.
Yes, ma'am. I think that adds a very important dimension to what is getting discussed.
1 second, Professor Prasad. If I can switch one question, borrowing from our esteemed guest, Ms. Vinita Bali. You have recently architected a new program and it is being offered right now. Are there any quick points which capture things like curiosity, opening of mind, making the students come alive and build their connections with industry and people, and generally be empathetic towards either consumers or people around? And that is what is education, that's as man said. Are there any reflections for us within the program that you have architected recently?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, there's research which says that more than 90% of the learning, even more than that, happens outside the classroom. And fortunately, the regulation which is brought in fully online MBA programs puts only 10% on classroom, and it puts 90% of the emphasis on what you do otherwise. Now that opens up huge terrain for all those, the esteemed institutions which have been allowed to offer online programs to think out how they can structure that 90%, because there's so much of opportunity out there. And that's what we have tried to do. We have begun to do. There's a long journey there because of the way education is structured. It's not easy. It's not easy to join up and connect both. But, for example, if I talk about the workplace and the immediate natural surroundings and environment of any workplace, any organization, I think any situation that you take from outside, if you're able to, it may not relate to your industry, but if you're able to take a situation, illustration, something which is small, many examples have been narrated in this particular webinar, and you're able to reflect on it with connection to your workplace or your community which is connected, and then connect it to concept. So their context gets connected to concept. So this is what we have been trying to reinforce repeatedly, that without understanding the context for which you need the curiosity, you can't transfer your skills, you can't develop skills if you don't have that. I think that's the way to go, and that's the way education needs to go. Fortunately, a big opportunity has come in front of us with respect to this online program. And the challenge is, how do you engage with this 90%? And then how you're able to build up on the individuals, or allow the person to build up on his or her competency using this.
Thank you. Please continue with your next question.
Ma'am, the next question is about, what is your view on the future of organization and the nation and the leadership in that particular context? How do you see this whole thing coming up in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
I don't know what you mean by this whole thing. This whole thing is what?
What I mean to say is that, we are talking about responsible leadership. And now if you want, from your view, from your very rich experience of what you've been seeing around, how do you foresee into the future of what will happen in this organization?
It all depends on, frankly, it all depends on each one of us. It all depends on the quality of people. How much are we going to accept? How much are we going to push back on? How we will behave in the context of our own organization. So again, rather than be theoretical, let me talk about 2 examples which are well known out there in the open. They happen to be from outside of India, but we've got plenty of examples in India as well. So take a very highly regarded company or brand like Volkswagen. The number 2 global brand in the world after Toyota. And what did Volkswagen do? They were smart enough to create a car that was smart enough to figure out whether it was being tested or it was being driven. And it emitted a different emission profile when it was being tested, which was within the limits, and a very different profile when it was being driven, which is outside of the limits. Now, somebody in that organization or some bodies in that organization were obviously aware of it and took the decision saying that it's okay. Now, I think several of us, there are many people on this call who are in responsible positions who will be called enough to make these decisions. I think we have to stop and ask ourselves, if I was in that place, what would I have done? And I think at the end of the day, it all boils down to a particular individual. And the higher you are in the hierarchy of the organization, the greater is your span of influence. And if decisions in the organization are always based on principles and values and very transparent guidelines, then the chances are that this will never happen. But when those decisions are influenced by something else, then things like this happen. There's another very well-known bank, that Wells Fargo, that created 2 million fictitious accounts. Now, it's not rocket science to figure out that these are things that should not be done. So the question is, there is something that is driving this behavior. Now, I don't want to say that this only happens overseas. A lot of it, in fact, more of it probably happens here. We keep talking about corruption in the system, etc., etc. I think our responsibility really is to say, if I can't change the entire world, or if I can't change all of India, if I can change the organizations I'm associated with, that I can influence either directly or indirectly, whether that is a school, an institute of learning, an NGO, an organization, a shop, an e-commerce company. If everybody did their bit, then the bigger picture would take care of itself.
Fantastic, ma'am. I think you've given a starting point, and I think it's a very hard-hitting statement, but extremely practical, extremely relevant, extremely needed. So the whole thing starts with what I should be doing first, my responsibility and what I do. And then if I build that authenticity, then perhaps I can then roll it out to a few others who are then my team. And hopefully if the span of influence increases and the opportunity comes, then I can unravel it to the organization and try to do something like that. Thank you, ma'am. That was excellent. I'd hand it back to Professor Sudhakar for the last cluster.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. We are now concluding the session, and I have just a small, tiny few questions, but they are very interesting. And a large number of our viewers are waiting for those answers from you. Ma'am, you've held many coveted positions in very good brands and reputed organizations in India and abroad. Rasna to Cadbury to Coca-Cola and several brands in Britannia. Which position, which organization, which stint was closest to your heart?
Actually, they all were because they added different things to me. I can't, it's a very difficult choice to make because, Rasna, I was straight out of MBA school, and it was the first brand that I launched. It became a success. Oftentimes I've thought about what it would have been like if it was a failure. And that's a good question to ask, because, we are going to face not just success, but also failure. But then there were many brands that, we launched during my marketing career that didn't do as well. And that's fine. I think we put too much emphasis on success and failure. And then, when the lists come out, the lists always talk in terms of billionaires. Why don't we have lists that talk in terms of what is the larger contribution that individuals have made, not just to business, but also to society? And when it comes to success and failure, the analogy I like to think about is that, I may be Djokovic, ranked number 1, That does not mean that I don't lose, some big game. But somehow in business, when something is not a success, we say, oh my God, this is a complete failure. It's not. I think success and failure is what we need to learn to take in our stride. So, I loved everything that I did, which is why I did it. I love everything that I'm doing now, which is why I'm doing it. And that's just my temperament.
Amazing, ma'am. I think so. It is you who made all of us love Rasna long back. So thank you very much for that. and ma'am, leadership comes with enormous amount of responsibility, as you have explained to us. And therefore, uneasy lies the head which wears the crown. Through all these things, so many initiatives and states and responsibilities and countries and continents, what as an individual has inspired you the most to stay your course and do what you have done?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, if you have conviction in what you're doing and you are not hung up about looking good or sounding good or whatever, at least my experience and my pathway has always been that, if you operate with conviction, what you do may not be a success, but people recognize what you bring, to that. And whether in business or in life, everything that you do. And I think that is the biggest lesson of leadership. But the other big lesson also is that, we have to keep trying. I can be, if I don't try anything, I'm not likely to fail, but I'm not likely to succeed. There is somebody who's not muted and who's on this line. So I think what is important is not to be too hung up about what the result will be. I think it's a little bit about if you believe in something and you put your best foot forward and do it, then the satisfaction of doing it will be its own reward, actually.
Amazing, ma'am. Thank you very much. Do something with conviction, and that will fetch your recognition, and keep trying irrespective of the outcome. Sometimes it is successful and sometimes it's a failure. One last question, ma'am, as they say, one for the road before we close. How to manage, we'll be talking about leadership. So how to manage leadership with good sleep?
Is to be a conscientious leader so that when you go to sleep, there's nothing that bothers you in your mind. I think, leadership is also about getting good sleep, actually.
Ma'am, thank you very much, ma'am, for your inputs. And we have taken 10 minutes extra of your time. And thank you very much for answering all the questions so patiently. And it is our good fortune that we could get this masterclass on leadership and especially leadership responsibility. I'm sure members of the audience have enjoyed the session, and I must, on behalf of ICFAI Group, on behalf of our chairperson, on behalf of everyone, profusely thank you for sparing your valuable time with us this evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for staying with us, and we will be meeting you again next Friday with yet another interesting webinar by Dr. Vinita, was one of the first management consultants in this country before the biggies like KPMG or McKinsey and anybody would have come to India. On 30th July at 6:30 p.m. we meet and see you all there. Till then, do take care, and I wish you all the best and have a great evening.